emphatically that the Congregational church was the established church. Of course, that was easy and comfortable for the Congregationalists, but it became very uncomfortable for practically everybody else, and indeed for many of the Congregationalists too, quite shortly, but that's a further story. So we've got a kind of established church, and as I was implying, in 1800, the issue is discipleship. How do people get along and live in communities? I'm going to introduce this or summarize this by reading just one very short paragraph from our book, The Cloud of Witnesses, which is the history of the Washington Congregational Church. But this is a general point. The church in the 18th century put the town on the spot. Although the selectmen saw it as their property and tax laws were observed, the selectmen saw that the tax laws were observed. Beyond that, there was little established authority to keep the public order. It fell to the church as a whole to be the quasi-legal judiciary in the early town. After all, the church was supported by taxation. Remember, we're talking about 1800. In a frontier farming society such as Washington, violent crime was practically unknown, theft was very uncommon, but quarrels were very common. In an earlier age, the church had elected tithing men, especially to ensure the keeping of the Sabbath, but in 1800 there were no tithing men in this part of the world. The church was expected to keep civic order, mostly by its own lights. That, after all, was one of the reasons for requiring a settled minister in a newly chartered town. If you had a minister, you had a church. If you had a church, you had some assurance of civic stability. That's not so much an explicit assignment of the church as it was a kind of unwritten understanding. So if there were quarrels in the town, quarrels about somebody's cows getting into your cabbage patch, quarrels about the folks that got drunk again last night, too much hard cider, folks about quarrels about gossipy reports in town that Joe Bloke was spending far too much time at his neighbor's house, especially when his neighbor, the husband, was out of town. That kind of thing. All these issues, if there was a complaint or if it was felt widely that something had to be done, they usually came to the church. There aren't policemen, there is no constabulary. The courts are far away and few. The selectmen have official governmental tasks, but not morality and piety tasks. Jim Schmuck has been skipping church regularly. Does somebody want to take note of that fact? It might come before the church. When we were doing the research for the history of Washington that Grace referred to, one of the things we noticed after we were reading pages and pages and pages of handwritten notes, that's what historians have to do. You've got to read lots of minutes of lots of meetings and develop some general perspective on what it is that's going on in that town. And when you read the church minutes of the Washington Congregational Church from 1800, and the Baptist Church minutes, and the Methodist Church minutes, and the Free Will Baptist Church minutes, you get a picture of the fabric of the society. One of the things we noticed and were surprised by is that there are an awfully lot of issues coming before the church that you wouldn't normally expect to be brought to the church. And then you scratch your head and say, well, yes, there isn't another place to bring them if they want to bring them somewhere. We noticed, for example, there were also some very short pastorates in the town of Washington and in other towns, but we have intimate acquaintance with the minutes of Washington and only general acquaintance with the minutes of other towns, but very short pastorates, and sometimes you wonder, maybe Dr. Lord, Mr. Lord didn't really find it very much fun to be the pastor in Washington because of the constant stream of quarrels that he had to deal with, which he felt didn't really have much to do with what he had been called to do and ordained to do. short pastorates, frequent quarrels, and so on. Now that's one of the things that struck us about this. And there was, of course, a huge background there. All of these churches were sort of part of the New England Protestantism that was responsible to what was called the Cambridge Platform of 1649, which laid out all kinds of disciplinary strategies for the churches and ministries. So they were doing what, in effect, they were ordained or expected to do. Now, there is another aspect of that, so that's the discipline issue. But the discipline issue was a broader one. It's one that had to do with the way in which the taxation was handled. Because the churches are supported by taxes, and this means that the selectmen have to collect the taxes, so they assign a ministerial tax and attach it to the real estate tax, and expect everybody to pay it, but not everybody could pay it, and so many of the farmers worked off their payment, and so there wasn't a whole lot worked off their payment by working on the road, and therefore they paid their taxes by working on the roads. What happened is that therefore there wasn't very much money that was taken in, taxes were worked off, and there was very little cash. And then you'd get a problem of the following sort, which is more ecclesiastical than tax. Supposing there's a Presbyterian or a Baptist church in the neighboring town. There's town A and B, and in A there's a Baptist church, but there's not one in B. And so the Baptists from town B go to town A to worship, and the Baptists from town C go to town A to worship, and from town D to worship. And then there are the Baptists in town A look at the situation and say, well, you know, there are 150 taxpayers in this town, and 50 of them are, or there are 150, and 50 of them are, it turns out, I should say, there are 150 citizens of this town, they say, and 50 of them turn out to be neighboring Baptists visiting. So it seems, says the Baptist church in town A, it seems as if we have 1/3 of the residents in this town, and so we get 1/3 of the ministerial tax. But the selectmen of town B aren't about to do that, because these people who are worshiping in the Baptist church in town A are in fact not residents of the town, and therefore not taxpayers. So, say the selectmen of town A, in that case we'd have to tax our people in order to pay you, and you're ministering to people who come from another town. No fair. Now that's just one example, but you can see how issues like this proliferate and grow. And the selectmen then get into talking with other selectmen about it. What about these Baptists who are crossing the line to go to church? But they're being taxed in your town, but you keep that tax money. But they're worshiping in our church, so we should have it. We can't have it from you, we can't have it from our selectmen. There are tax issues of this sort that kept coming in, and the more denominations there were, when Presbyterians and Methodists appeared as well as Baptists, and when a few Quakers and a few Will Baptists, now you've got 4 or 5 denominations, plus Unitarians who don't really want to think of themselves as a church. You have the potential for all kinds of problems. That's one of the underlying situations that generated many of the quarrels that were brought to the church. So what you have is a major issue that you can broadly put under the umbrella of discipline. And it's interesting to people, but it's difficult for people, and it's problematic for people, both within the town, between the Congregationalists and the Baptists, and between the towns, between the Presbyterians who are worshiping in another town and wondering where their tax money is going. When we worked on the history of Washington, we discovered also that there's one way of dealing that selectmen often had and that church people often had, not selectmen, I mean the churches had, for dealing with some of these quarrels. And that is, if someone brought in a complaint about so-and-so's behavior, or thievery, or misbehavior of whatever sort it was, frequently it was drunkenness, the selectmen had a form which was supplied to the church had a form, the pastor had a form, which was called a citation. Now, a citation was a very important element of the discipline of the church in 1800. And it was a form that said, in effect, you, R.J., are required to appear at such and such a time. It was a fill-in-the-blank form in order to answer for the issue of, usually covenant breaking was filled in there, and to give satisfaction, therefore. In short, you were asked to come before the church, and your offense was announced, and you were obliged to give satisfaction, therefore, or give a full accounting of yourself. Now, this was a pattern which was used around 1800, but you can see how this is sufficiently offensive on the face of it, so that it wasn't going to last very long. So far as I can tell, after about 1820, it wasn't used at all. But it was a very important part of the ecclesiastical equipment in 1800. Discipline in its broad form of monitoring the behavior of people, and in its very specific but especially pernicious form of equitably apportioning the tax income to the various denominations. This was a major issue in 1800, but by 1820 it was resolved. So we jumped suddenly to, it wasn't totally resolved obviously, but part of it was resolved, because one of the most interesting and underlying forms of the disciplinary issues of 1800 was precisely the phenomenon of multiple congregations appearing. That was clearly the most arresting and disturbing phenomenon of all. No longer, it appeared, was the Congregational Church the only or principal or assumed church. Yet, in fact, it was these churches that had built most of the ecclesiastical architecture in New Hampshire. But there were other congregations and other denominations nearby. One thing that happened before 1820 was many towns, I don't know how many, but many towns said, look, there's too much difficulty associated with distributing taxes to the various denominations, so we're not going to distribute any tax money to any denomination. We're just not going to support it. This was technically a violation of the law, but it was probably a good strategy in towns where it was a particularly vexed issue. In almost all of these towns, however, they said, that the selectmen said, we will provide for the use of the common meeting house, which was built by everyone as a public and as a church and as a place for town government. Any denomination must be permitted to use the meeting house, and the Congregationalists, who are dominant, as they were in almost every place, simply have to find a way to make allowance for the use of the meeting house by other denominations. So that's the way in which selectmen and towns salved their conscience about not paying any money at all to the various churches. They saved their conscience by saying, we'll allow all the churches to use the meeting house. Well, you can see this is not likely to last very long as a solution, and it didn't. Very quickly, the conversation in New Hampshire became centered on the question, why is the government in the business of religion at all? Now, that was a heretical and wild idea a decade before. Before 1800, no one even questioned it. When I say no one, I'm not really counting noses here. I'm only saying it was not an issue. After 1800, it became an issue. as a sub-point of the disciplinary matter, and became a greater and greater issue. And when towns went out of the business of paying it, it was felt that something ought to be done, and the legislature then began debating the idea of simply removing the obligation of the town, of any town, to support religion. At that time, they might have called it religion and morality, because this was a kind of one hyphenated concept at the time. The other thing that had began happening in the teens is that there came to the fore a new sort of conceptual idea. Namely, there ought to be for each church a society. That was the word that was used. A society which was an incorporated entity whose business it would be to provide the salaries and the buildings, a church building if needed, repair a church building if needed, provide a salary for